When a creator puts time and effort into making something that they hope to share with an audience, there is almost always a purpose. Oftentimes, there are even multiple purposes. These may be self-serving, to serve the audience, or both. In the case of The Messenger, which was developed by Sabotage Studio and released on August 30th, 2018, the game felt like the creator had three main purposes: to do something they love, to make something their audience would love, and to prove that they could create something that they could be proud of. So, in spirit of this interpretation, I'll embody those same qualities in my attempt to provide a deconstruction of this nostalgia-driven indie gem. Oh, and also, we want to make sure speedrunners are accommodated, so if this isn't your first time watching this video, feel free to watch it double speed or wall clip to specific sections using the timestamps. Don't worry, if you don't do a perfect job, you can rewatch the video as much as you want and try to get a little bit better each time. The Messenger dives straight into its narrative in the title menu before even starting the game, so we may as well start there too. In short, the story revolves around a clan of ninjas who must prepare for their inexorable conflict with the demon army, while also awaiting the arrival of a legendary hero from the west. Upon starting the game, we find ourselves in control of one of the ninjas. Bored with training and unconcerned by the prophecies regarding the demon army, this particular ninja has developed a reputation as a lackadaisical slacker. But of course, just as he's assuring his master that there's no reason to take the threat of the demon army so seriously, there's a sudden attack. Most of the ninja clan is immediately wiped out, and our hero charges forth to face off against the Demon King. Just then, the hero from the west arrives and repels the invaders. The Demon King and his general retreat, vowing to finish the job later. The hero from the west informs the ninja that he has a very important job: to cross the island and deliver a message to the three sages at the summit of Glacial Peak. It is at this point that the character becomes the titular messenger, which is what I will refer to him as from now on, as the Messenger, which also happens to be the name of the game. So don't get confused, because there's the Messenger the guy and the Messenger the game, and I'm expecting you to use context clues and inference to understand which of the two I'm talking about at any given time. I have faith in you. Well, some of you. So anyway, that's how the journey begins. And that's about it, for a while at least. Precious little is revealed about the Messenger, the guy or the game, or the demon army, or the world, or much of anything else for that matter, for most of the rest of the game. The only sort of exception is the shopkeeper. He is happy to share stories with the Messenger, but these are usually random tales and fables and not really related to the Messenger's journey at all. The one major exception is information regarding area bosses, which the shopkeeper will almost always warn about and even sometimes share some of their history. Almost all of the shopkeeper's dialogue is totally optional, and while most of it does not relate directly to the game's plot, it is important that I take a moment here to make sure I'm not underselling it. The writing for the shopkeeper is funny and insightful and clever. It was one of the highlights of the game for me. While they do get a little carried away with the fourth wall breaks, I felt like the character struck a great balance between jovially ominous and reluctantly helpful. I was always excited to return to the shop just to see if the shopkeeper had anything new to say. The fact that all of the dialogue is optional is also a nice touch. If the player just wants to run, jump, and slice their way through each area without pause, they're welcome to. The game does its best not to force its narrative on the player. In fact, the only other exposition before reaching what I'll call the halfway point of the game is with the area bosses. But just like the shopkeeper, their interactions with the Messenger usually do very little to illuminate the greater narrative at play. At the aforementioned halfway point, the Messenger's role in the story is recontextualized a bit, and the goal of taking revenge against the Demon King is postponed so that other objectives can be fulfilled. We start hopping back and forth in time only to realize that, sometimes, time makes a fool of us all. And then, much like before, any trace of narrative essentially evaporates until just about the end of the game. Now, to avoid spoilers, we'll just say this: the actual plot is fairly original, and just enough information is given to hold interest. The twists are even unexpected and fun. The characters are well written, and there's a good balance of comedy and introspection. But delaying the majority of the narrative until the very end was a pretty bold choice. Sure, this sort of thing was par for the course in the heyday of the games that the Messenger emulates, but it was a little bit jarring to be told the majority of the story right before the final level. While this might be true to the spirit of its inspiration, it did have the downside of not giving the narrative quite enough time to breathe. Now, the way that I've described it so far, I feel like it may sound as if the story was shoehorned into a game that didn't really need one to begin with, and while that's a fair argument, it's not really my interpretation of the situation. It's a video game, and as long as it has great gameplay, no small amount of players will enjoy it immensely without giving the story so much as a second thought. This is true of virtually any game that isn't a visual novel, and even then, some people are more interested in the, art. We'll call it art. So anyway, no, it's not that the story is unnecessary, it's more so that Sabotage wanted to make absolutely sure that the gameplay was impeded as little as possible by players who might find text boxes a little bit scary. They made a deliberate choice that the plot would take a backseat to the action, and for a game of this design, that was the correct choice. It's a fast-paced 2D action platformer, a spiritual successor to NES games like Ninja Gaiden and Mega Man. Literally no one came here for the plot to begin with. Side note, my interest in the Messenger was derived from my enjoyment of its sequel, Sea of Stars, and I came here for the plot to begin with. Dang. I guess time really does make a fool of us all. The Messenger has a pixel art aesthetic which harkens back to the 8 and 16-bit days of the NES and Super NES. Yes, both. As part of the game's narrative, the main character travels back and forth between two different times. The present is drawn in 8-bit, and the future is 16-bit. I think this is a very cool concept, and as someone who first cut his teeth on games from the 8-bit era, the visuals resonated with me. The pixel art is solid, although the 16-bit stuff does look markedly better than the 8-bit stuff. It actually made me biased toward playing in the future timeline, at least as much as the game would allow. I can't put my finger on why exactly, but the contrasting graphical styles didn't hit me in the way that I believe that the developers intended for it to. I get the impression I was supposed to be wowed when I saw the 16-bit version of things, and I was, but it also made the 8-bit versions look poorer by comparison. Or perhaps another way of saying it is that I appreciated the 8-bit artwork less. Instead of feeling like I was traveling between the past and the future, I felt more like I was flipping back and forth between the game's beta build and its final release. Graphically speaking, of course, there's no difference in the gameplay. Look, don't get me wrong. The game looks good in both its 8-bit and 16-bit forms, and again, I applaud the concept. I think the idea itself is neat. It's just that, for whatever reason, it didn't make me feel like I think I was expected to. Ultimately, for those of us who enjoy pixel art, there was plenty to enjoy here and not much to complain about. In terms of audio, the Messenger punches above its weight class. Not only is the soundtrack fantastic, but the sound team really went above and beyond. For instance, when traveling from past to future, the instrumentation changes. When in the past, which is represented by 8-bit graphics, the music has a real chiptune vibe. But when you're in the future, the 16-bit areas, the music is much more full and dynamic. Not only does this capture the difference between the two console generations, but each version of each song has been fully recomposed from the ground up. They didn't just run the tracks through an 8-bitizer or chiptune sound font and call it a day. Every song was composed twice, once to fit each style, and it definitely helped the game in carving out its very specific identity. In general, the music is just great. It's upbeat and catchy with great percussion. The tracks help each different area flesh out their personality and feel more distinct. I especially loved Autumn Hills, but there really isn't a bad tune in the entire soundtrack. It's such a great body of work that I will definitely make sure to check out any projects that composer Rainbow Dragon Eyes, or should I say Eric W. Brown, is involved with in the future. Just don't make me wait 500 years. As for the rest of the sound design, it's also good. Much like the music, most of the sound design goes out of its way to fit not only the style of the game, but the era of games which inspired it, and does a great job in doing so. The The core gameplay loop in the Messenger is running from screen to screen, overcoming obstacles and slaying enemies. At the end of each area, there is a boss fight. After completing certain tasks or reaching certain progression points, new abilities are unlocked. It continues in a linear fashion this way for the first portion of the game until it eventually opens up and becomes more of a Metroidvania, at which point there becomes a greater emphasis on backtracking, exploration, and light puzzle solving. In other words, the Messenger's straightforward beginning belies a much greater ambition. It may start out like a quarter-sucking arcade game from the 80s or the Nintendo equivalent thereof, but as the player progresses, it grows in scope in a way that is both organic as well as innovative. By the end of the game, the Messenger has become a new genre with new graphics, a new narrative, and new gameplay elements. But how does it fare in accomplishing all of its mini goals? As a 2D action platformer, the most important thing that the Messenger has to get right is the feel of the player character. And it nails this feeling. The Messenger is quick and agile, intuitive and responsive. The competency of the character is a direct reflection of the competency of the player, and that's how it should be. And what of the world that was developed for the character to exist in? What of the challenges, the levels, the bosses, and the feeling of progression? In a word, it feels refined. It has a very clear understanding of what it wants to do and to be, and it succeeds in doing and being that. It is a seamless blend of inspiration with innovation, a marriage of old and new. It is also a game that tries desperately not to overstay its welcome. There is very little repetition in the gameplay itself. The boss fights are all markedly different from one another, and each zone offers its own variety of enemies and obstacles to complement the basic set. The overall difficulty of the game is not particularly high, certainly not as high as games tended to be when they were originally made to look and play like this one, but there are occasional difficulty spikes that can be a little bit frustrating. I remember that on 2 different occasions I got so frustrated with a specific section of the game I was working on that I had to take a break and come back to it later. I did, however, quickly clear these parts once I returned to them fresh. One thing that alleviates difficulty is the use of incredibly forgiving invincibility frames. This is the time window where a player gets hit by an enemy or obstacle and is invulnerable to any further damage during recovery. It gives the Messenger an almost dynamic difficulty wherein the player is given a pass to the next section of the game even if they haven't mastered the section before it. However, the player can only take so many hits before forfeiting their life and returning to their last save, which is what prevents this from being a total crutch. Speaking of death, the way that the Messenger handles this and loss of progression is rather elegant. Throughout the game, the player will collect time shards, both through platforming feats as well as through defeating enemies. These time shards are used as currency at the shop to upgrade the character's abilities. We'll come back to that in a minute. Upon death, instead of going the Dark Souls route and having the character drop all of their time shards, the character is sent back to the most recent checkpoint and followed by a demon who will steal any new time shards collected until they've been sated. In the story, this is explained as compensation for the demon saving the character from actual death. This debt is usually paid within a few screens and manages to punish the player just enough to give failure meaning, but not so much as to give death the potential to be utterly devastating. Also, the demon has a large range of reactions and responses to saving the player, many of which are context sensitive and some of which are pretty funny. This further helps take a bit of the sting out of failure. Overall, at least for me, the game balance and difficulty were a bit of a double-edged sword. It allowed me to continue through the game without becoming especially frustrated or discouraged at any point, but it also left me feeling like the intended experience had been a little watered down. I was never really forced to truly master the character's movement or abilities, and so I never did. For a more casual player such as myself, the Messenger offers a taste of what it might be like to be a ninja. But other players, who went on to do New Game Plus cycles or do speedruns, were very likely to end up feeling like the totally bona fide real deal. Now let's talk a little bit about the shop and the abilities that these time shards are spent on. It's a rather simple upgrade tree, and the abilities tend to increase the character's survivability more so than their utility. More health and health recovery, more ways to do damage, that sort of thing. Instead of coming from the shop, most of the abilities that do things, such as the wall climb and the rope dart, are unlocked instead by story progression. By comparison, the upgrade tree that requires time shards feels a little bland and superficial. Only the first few choices make any real difference, and that lasts for a very short while. The non-shop upgrades are a bit more of a mixed bag. Certain things, like the aforementioned wall climb and rope dart, feel like a natural part of the Messenger's toolkit and core part of his identity as a ninja. Other abilities feel, and in fact are, little more than keys. The ability to see in the dark, for instance, or to run on liquid might sound cool, but in reality they just give the player access to new areas which are the only places that the player will use these abilities. It is for this reason that the Metroidvania portion of the game feels a bit underwhelming. Instead of feeling like I discovered an awesome secret, I usually felt like I just found the necessary and sometimes arbitrary requirement for progression. Speaking of progression, about halfway through the Messenger is when the map opens up and when the game starts to implement the whole past versus future representations of each area. And it is extremely neat to see a screen or an area recontextualized on two fronts like this. Once as the in-game past or future, and again as the 8-bit or 16-bit era of gaming. I truly adore this concept, and the use of remixed music really helps to sell it. It's so cool to hop back and forth in time and see the world and the enemies and everything else change. With changes to the sounds and sights as well as the objective and even style, it almost feels like two games in one, or like a game and its own sequel. It's a really, really cool idea. However, and this is a big however, it's kind of a gimmick. The impact on the gameplay and even the game itself are decidedly minimal. There are only a handful of times when all of the work and creativity that the developers put into this concept is actually used to its potential. Instead of being used to create truly unique bouts of exploration or devious puzzles, it's mostly used as an aesthetic. A very cool, but ultimately pointless aesthetic. Well, I guess being cool isn't pointless, but simply being cool falls short of what could have been done here. I'm not trying to bash the game, and if you can't tell by now, I really liked The Messenger. I had a lot of fun with it, and I have a lot of respect for the development team. In fact, having spent an inordinate amount of time on this script and analysis of this game, I even feel like I can relate. This video may not reach its full potential, and it may even have flaws, but it's been in the oven long enough. It needs to be presented to the public for what it is so that I can move on to something bigger and better. So if you're still with me, please stick it out a little bit longer. I'm obligated to point out a few more shortcomings before I can come back and tie it all together. So one thing the game doesn't really do is give the player a final test. The final level and the final boss are not a traditional summary of the skills we've built up thus far. They're just another challenge. An interesting, and within the context of the game, unique challenge, and perhaps the hardest challenge so far, but not a comprehensive one. It wasn't bad per se, but like some of the things I mentioned earlier, it could have been better and in a very obvious way. For all of the ways in which I feel like The Messenger misses its potential, there are just as many ways in which it absolutely reaches it. The many refinements and innovation to the genre are as impressive as they are enjoyable. By pointing out its missed opportunities, I only hope that helps to create a distinction between unfulfilled potential and actual flaws. And for all of my crotchety old man yelling at cloud energy, there's only one flaw in The Messenger that I can speak to. That is in regard to backtracking. Near the end of the game, when hunting down collectibles and whatnot, there is a considerable amount of backtracking. No new enemies to face, no further use for time shards, no significant discoveries to make except for the very specific things the player is in need of collecting. Just backtracking. And at this point of the game, The Messenger, in all of its efforts to make the absolute most of its world and the player's time, fails to do so. While the game does have a fairly generous teleport system, the teleports are only accessible from a specific area, and that specific area is only accessible via the teleports. The result is a game that is extremely lean up until it's not, and the change in the gameplay is noticeable in the worst kind of way. This all could have been resolved by giving the player the ability to teleport to any of the designated areas from anywhere instead of only from the designated areas. Is it a huge problem? No, it's mildly annoying, but something mildly annoying in a game that is otherwise superb sticks out like a sore thumb. The Messenger was obviously created by people who love games and understand what makes games great. With nearly a decade-long development cycle, it's also pretty clear they understand what makes games not great. Special care was taken to ensure the gameplay felt as good as possible. The result is a lean and refined experience that would become the harbinger for this team's design philosophy, at least insofar as their sophomore effort, Sea of Stars, is concerned. And I, for one, hope it stays that way. The graphics are a nostalgic treat and the music rocks. While the plot didn't take itself too seriously, which was probably for the better, it was still an original and thoughtfully crafted offering in a game that's ultimately about walking to the right and stabbing stuff. And while I found the connections to Sea of Stars to be interesting in hindsight, they're also a bit tenuous, and it's difficult to say how I would have felt about them if I had played The Messenger first. In short, I really enjoyed the dozen or so hours I spent with the game, and I'm happy to leave it there. Its shortcomings were very few, but because The Messenger is an otherwise pristine experience, these shortcomings are rather noticeable. Regardless, it's a truly great game that I would recommend to anyone who grew up on games like this.